Today's story is for everyone who has ever been underestimated, everyone who has ever been dismissed, everyone who has ever sat in silence while cruel people laughed in their face and thought, just wait, your time is coming. Let me tell you something that history books do not emphasize enough. A man named Al Capone was shot multiple times by rival gangs and left for dead in a Chicago alley. They said Scarface was finished. They toasted to his death in speakeasies across the city. But 6 months later, he rose from that hospital bed and built an empire that made his enemies weep blood. He controlled every politician, every cop, every inch of Chicago, until the only thing that could stop him was the federal government itself. Lucky Luciano was beaten so savagely that his throat was slit, and he was left hanging from a meat hook. They called him a dead man walking, but that dead man walked straight into the history books as the father of modern organized crime. Meyer Lansky was a small Jewish boy in a world of giants. They laughed at his size, mocked his accent, underestimated his mind, and that underestimated mind built a financial empire so vast that even the FBI could never trace its edges. These men understood something that the glittering socialites in their penthouses never could. Weakness is not defeat. It is camouflage. It is armor. It is the last thing your enemies see before you destroy them. And tonight's story is about a king who understood that lesson better than anyone who came before him. A man who let the entire underworld believe he was broken, shattered, finished. A man confined to a wheelchair after a car bomb, meant to end his reign, dependent on his lieutenants, pitied by the very traitors who had tried to murder him. They called him the Broken King. They whispered that his mind had shattered along with his body. They smiled in boardrooms and congratulated themselves on their victory. They patted his shoulder like he was a child, and spoke slowly as if his ears had failed along with his legs. They divided his empire among themselves, like vultures picking at a carcass. They had no idea he was watching, listening, planning, writing down every name, every betrayal, every moment of treachery in a black ledger that would one day come due. His name was Gabriel Ashford, 36 years old, once the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, now reduced to a drooling invalid in a wheelchair, or so they believed. And then he needed a wife. Not for love, not for companionship, but for the final piece of his plan. And fate delivered to him Scarlett Hayes, 27 years old, a woman whose own father had sold her like livestock to pay his gambling debts, a woman who had watched her 14-year-old brother dragged away by human traffickers because her father needed to cover his losses, a woman who had worked 3 jobs for 9 years to pay debts that were never hers, who had been beaten, humiliated, scarred, but never, not once, had she bowed her head to anyone. She walked into his mansion, expecting to serve a broken man, expecting nothing but duty and degradation from a marriage of convenience. And on their wedding night, when she stood in that bedroom preparing herself for the worst, he rose from that wheelchair, crossed the room on 2 steady legs, looked into her eyes with a gaze sharp enough to cut diamonds, and whispered the words that would bring an empire of traitors crashing down. Now the real game begins. Let me take you back to a crumbling apartment in Queens, where Scarlett Hayes was about to discover that the most dangerous predators are the ones who make you believe they cannot hunt. If this story speaks to your soul, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a moment. Because in this world, the ones who wait in silence always strike the hardest. The apartment sat on the 5th floor of a decaying building in Queens, a place where the stairwell reeked of urine and the walls were stained with spreading patches of mold like wounds that never healed. Scarlett Hayes pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside, her hands still burning red after soaking in dishwater for 12 straight hours. She had just finished her shift at the restaurant, before that 6 hours standing at a nail salon, and before that 4 hours cleaning office buildings at 4 in the morning. Her body ached so deeply that she no longer remembered what it felt like not to be in pain. But the moment she saw her father sitting there on the torn sofa, a cheap bottle of whiskey in his hand and that smile she had learned to hate over the years, she knew this night wouldn't end with ordinary exhaustion. Robert Hayes lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot from alcohol yet glinting with something Scarlett had never seen before. Hope, or perhaps the relief of a man about to be freed from a burden. He waved for her to sit and said he had good news, the best news in years, that everything was about to change, that they were about to be free. Scarlett didn't sit. She stood there with her arms crossed over her chest and asked in a voice as cold as steel what he had done. Robert Hayes laughed, the laugh of a drunk who no longer knew shame, and said he had found a way to erase the $5 million debt, that no one would come pounding on the door with threats anymore, that Scarlett didn't have to work like a mule until she died. She looked at her father and felt a chill crawl up her spine because she knew that in this world, nothing was free, especially freedom. She asked again what he had done, and this time her voice wasn't cold but trembling with something close to fear. Robert Hayes set the whiskey bottle on the table and looked at his daughter with an expression he probably thought was affectionate but was really just cowardice in disguise, and said that Gabriel Ashford wanted to marry her. The room fell silent. Scarlett heard her own heart pounding in her ears, heard the old air conditioner humming from the neighboring apartment, heard the traffic from the street below, but she couldn't hear anything that mattered anymore. Gabriel Ashford. The name echoed in her mind like a death sentence. The crippled king. That was what people called him. The man in the wheelchair after the car explosion 3 years ago. The man rumored to have lost control of both body and mind. The man, people whispered, needed someone to wipe his drool every day. She looked at her father and asked in a broken voice if he was selling her to a cripple, if that was how he was paying his debt, if after everything he had taken from her he was now taking her future too. Robert Hayes wouldn't meet his daughter's eyes. He stared at the filthy floor and muttered that this was the only chance, that if she didn't agree, they would die, that the loan sharks wouldn't wait any longer, that this wasn't a choice but survival. Scarlett felt as if someone were squeezing her throat. She thought of the past 9 years. 9 years of working like an animal to repay debts she never borrowed. 9 years of enduring beatings from creditors demanding money her father didn't have. 9 years of living in the pit her father had dug and pushed her into. And now, after all that, he stood there with a whiskey bottle in his hand and told her she had to marry a cripple to save him. She wanted to scream, to smash everything, to grab her father by the collar and ask why. Why he had brought her into this world if it was only to sell her like merchandise. But Scarlett didn't do any of that. She had learned long ago that shouting didn't change anything, that tears didn't soften the hearts of people who had none, that in this world she could only rely on herself. She looked at her father with eyes cold as ice and asked when. Robert Hayes replied that tomorrow she would be taken to the Ashford estate to meet him, and if everything went smoothly, the wedding would take place within a week. Scarlett nodded, not because she accepted it, but because she understood that in that moment she didn't have the strength to fight back. But deep inside her, a fire began to burn. The fire she had kept smoldering for 9 years. The fire of hatred, of waiting, of a vow that one day everyone who had made her suffer would pay. That night, Scarlett didn't sleep. She lay on the worn-out bed with a mattress so thin she could feel every metal bar of the frame pressing into her back, staring up at a ceiling stained with spreading watermarks, letting memory drag her back to the night her life truly ended. 9 years earlier, in a miserable apartment no different from this one. She was 18, and Ryan was 14. Her younger brother was a skinny boy with brown eyes like their mother's, and a smile that could light up even the darkest days. Ryan loved reading, loved dreaming that one day he would become a doctor, loved sitting by the window telling Scarlett about the stars he had read about at the library. That night, while Scarlett was working on her community college homework, clinging to a fragile hope for a better future, the door was kicked open. 3 men stepped inside, large, tattooed, their eyes cold like venomous snakes. Her father, Robert Hayes, stood behind them with his head bowed and shoulders trembling. Scarlett remembered clearly how he didn't dare look her in the eyes, how he retreated into the corner like a terrified rat while the men moved toward Ryan. She screamed and rushed to stand in front of her brother, demanding to know what they wanted, threatening to call the police. One of them laughed, a hollow laugh that never reached his eyes, and said her father owed them a very large sum of money, that he had signed an agreement to use the boy to settle the debt, that this was business, and she shouldn't interfere. Scarlett turned to her father, searching for denial, for an explanation, for anything that might prove this was just a nightmare. But Robert Hayes kept his head down, kept shaking, kept silent, and she understood. She understood that her father had truly sold her brother to traffickers to pay his gambling debt. Ryan began to cry, clinging to her arm and calling her name in panic. Scarlett wrapped herself around him, shielding him with her body, swearing they would have to step over her corpse first. One of the men stepped forward and punched her square in the face, the blow so hard it sent her crashing to the floor, blood spilling from her split lip. Ryan screamed and tried to reach her, but the other 2 men grabbed him. Scarlett forced herself up and lunged at them, clawing, biting, striking with everything she had. But she was only an 18-year-old girl, fighting 3 large men trained to inflict pain. They shoved her away, slammed her into the wall with such force that her head struck concrete and everything blurred. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Ryan's face. Brown eyes flooded with tears and terror, his mouth screaming her name as he was dragged out the door. The last thing she heard was his crying, his begging, his voice calling for her as if she were the only one who could save him. But she didn't save him. When Scarlett woke up, Ryan was gone. Her father sat in the corner, drinking and sobbing about how he had no other choice, about how they would have killed the whole family if he hadn't paid the debt, about how Ryan would be fine. Scarlett didn't say a word. She stood up, blood still running from the wound on her head, went into the bathroom, looked into the mirror, and didn't recognize the woman staring back. That night she cried until there were no tears left, until her throat burned raw and her eyes were swollen shut. And after that night, she never cried again. For 9 years, she searched for Ryan in every way she could. She went to the police station and was laughed at for having no evidence. She hired private investigators and lost all her savings with nothing to show for it. She wandered through dark streets, grimy bars, places where she knew traffickers operated, hoping for a clue. But Ryan had been swallowed by the darkness without leaving a trace. And now, lying here in the dark, knowing that tomorrow she would be handed over to a stranger like an object, Scarlett felt the long scar on her back, a reminder of the time a creditor threatened her with a knife when she had no money to pay, begin to itch and burn as if it had just been carved into her skin. She closed her eyes and wondered where Ryan was now, whether he was still alive, whether he still remembered her. Then she thought of her father, sleeping soundly in the next room, unaware that in his daughter's heart a death sentence had already been signed. Scarlett didn't know where this marriage would lead her, didn't know what kind of man Gabriel Ashford truly was, didn't know whether she would live or die, but she knew one thing: one day, one way or another, Robert Hayes would pay for what he had done to Ryan, to her, to this family. And when that day came, she would stand there and watch him collapse without shedding a single tear, because he had taken all her tears from her 9 years ago. The black car picked Scarlett up the next morning, a gleaming Rolls-Royce parked in front of the decaying building in Queens, like a god from another world lost in hell. She stepped out of the apartment without looking back at her father, without saying goodbye, leaving behind nothing but the cold silence she had cultivated for 9 years. The journey from Queens to Manhattan took only 40 minutes, but to Scarlett it felt like traveling through 2 completely different worlds, from filthy streets choked with trash and homeless people, to tree-lined avenues framed by soaring skyscrapers and luxury storefronts. When the car stopped in front of the Ashford estate, Scarlett had to steady her face to keep it from revealing shock. It wasn't a house. It was a Gothic palace in the heart of Manhattan, with sharp towers piercing the gray sky, stained glass windows glinting under weak sunlight, and a massive iron gate adorned with the image of 2 roaring lions. The gate opened, and the car glided along the stone-paved drive toward the main entrance, where 2 men stood waiting. The first man Scarlett noticed appeared to be around 45 years old, tall and lean with salt and pepper, hair slicked back and eyes the color of cold steel. He wore a flawless black suit, stood straight as a ruler with his hands folded in front of his abdomen, and when Scarlett stepped out of the car, he looked her up and down with a gaze she knew all too well, the gaze of someone appraising merchandise. "This is Victor Crane," the driver announced as Scarlett approached, the vice president of Ashford Empire and the man who ran all business operations on behalf of Mr. Ashford. Victor Crane didn't smile or greet her. He simply nodded once and said she was on time. At least she had one good quality. Scarlett didn't respond. She met his stare without blinking, a habit she had learned during years of facing creditors, because if she showed fear, they would tear her apart. The second man was younger, around 28, with tousled blonde hair and a handsome face straight out of a fashion magazine. But his eyes, those green eyes, looked at Scarlett in a way that made her want to step back, the way a predator looks at prey, the way a man looks at a woman he believes he has the right to own. "Maxwell Crane," he introduced himself with a wide grin, Victor's son and the one who would help her adjust to life here. He stepped closer, too close, deliberately invading Scarlett's personal space, then said his father hadn't mentioned she was this beautiful, that it was such a waste for a flower like her to wither beside a cripple like Gabriel Ashford. Scarlett didn't retreat. She looked straight into Maxwell's eyes and replied in a voice cold as ice that she wasn't a flower and she certainly didn't need anyone to water her. Maxwell laughed loudly, more amused than offended, then turned to his father and said this feral cat had claws. Victor Crane didn't laugh. He simply studied Scarlett with a calculating gaze and said they should go inside. Mr. Ashford was waiting. As she passed through the massive oak doors, Scarlett felt as though she were stepping into another world, a world of marble and crystal chandeliers, of ancient paintings and Persian carpets, of wealth so overwhelming it made the air feel heavy. Yet beneath that dazzling luxury, she sensed something else, an atmosphere thick, like the moment before a storm, a simmering tension flowing beneath every glance, every gesture, every word. The estate was beautiful like a work of art, but Scarlett knew that behind the most beautiful art often lay the darkest secrets, and she was about to walk straight into the heart of that darkness. They led Scarlett through long, seemingly endless corridors, lined with portraits of the Ashford ancestors hanging on the walls, stern faces with eyes that seemed to follow her every step. Victor Crane walked ahead with the decisive stride of a man accustomed to command, while Maxwell stayed right beside Scarlett, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, a sweetness so cloying it made her nauseous. At last they stopped before a pair of intricately carved mahogany doors, and Victor knocked 3 short times before pushing them open. Inside was a vast library with bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling, a fireplace crackling softly in one corner, and dark brown leather chairs arranged around a large oak table. But the first thing Scarlett saw wasn't the room's luxury. It was the wheelchair positioned near the window, and the man sitting in it. Gabriel Ashford looked like a ghost of himself. She had heard the rumors and prepared herself for what she might see, but the reality still stunned her for a moment. He had slightly long black hair falling over his forehead, skin pale as if it hadn't seen sunlight in years, and gray eyes staring into nothing with a vacant, dulled expression. His head tilted slightly to one side, his mouth hung faintly open, and his hands resting on the armrests of the wheelchair trembled like leaves in an autumn wind. Standing behind the wheelchair was a large man in his 40s with an expressionless face, whom Scarlett guessed was Marcus Cole, Gabriel's bodyguard and caretaker she had heard Victor mention in the car. Victor Crane stepped up beside the wheelchair and spoke loudly and slowly, emphasizing every word as if speaking to a child, saying, "Gabriel, this is your bride. She's named Scarlett Hayes. Do you remember? We talked about her last week." Gabriel blinked sluggishly, his head turning toward Scarlett with the stiff motion of a puppet pulled by strings. Then he opened his mouth and released a series of broken sounds. She's beautiful, Victor, she is." Maxwell chuckled softly beside Scarlett and whispered in her ear that she saw it now. This was her future husband, a business genius who once made the entire East Coast tremble and now couldn't finish a sentence. Pathetic, wasn't it? Scarlett didn't answer Maxwell. She stepped forward, moving closer to the wheelchair, and did something no one in that room seemed to expect. She looked straight into Gabriel Ashford's eyes, not with pity, not with disgust, not with fear, but with the level gaze of one person assessing another. And in that moment, when their eyes met, Scarlett swore she saw something. A flicker of light flashed through those dull gray eyes, so fast she almost thought she imagined it, yet clear enough to burn itself into her mind. It wasn't the gaze of an unstable madman. It was the gaze of a predator watching from the shadows. Gabriel stammered, You aren't afraid of me," and his voice was still broken and trembling. But that question wasn't the question of a man who'd lost his mind. Scarlett replied calmly that she had lived through things nightmares were afraid of, that he wasn't on the list of things she needed to worry about. The room fell silent. Victor Crane frowned, clearly displeased by Scarlett's composure. Maxwell stopped smiling, his eyes narrowing with calculation. And Gabriel Ashford looked at Scarlett with eyes she was no longer sure were vacant. Then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, just a fraction, a movement so small she might have been the only one to notice. Then he turned to Victor and said, his voice still uneven yet somehow clearer than before, "I want to meet her alone before the wedding." Victor protested immediately, saying Gabriel didn't need to do that everything had already been arranged, that he would take care of it all. But Gabriel cut him off, and this time there was no stutter, no hesitation, only 4 words spoken with a sharpness that froze the entire room. "I am still the head of this family, Victor, have you forgotten?" In that moment, Scarlett saw Victor Crane go pale, saw Maxwell stiffen, saw Marcus Cole smile faintly behind the wheelchair, and she understood that something was wrong here, that Gabriel Ashford wasn't as simple as everyone believed, that she had stepped into a game whose rules she didn't understand, yet somehow she knew her survival depended on how quickly she learned them. That night, when the Ashford estate sank into darkness and a silence thick enough to suffocate, Marcus Cole appeared outside the sitting room where Scarlett had been temporarily placed and motioned for her to follow him. They walked through deserted corridors lit only by moonlight filtering through tall windows, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors like the steady beat of a heart waiting for something to happen. Marcus didn't speak, didn't explain, simply led the way with a calm expression, as if this were a nightly routine. At last they stopped before a door Scarlett recognized as the study where she had met Gabriel earlier that afternoon, and Marcus opened it and stepped aside without a word. Scarlett went in. The room was lit by the fire burning in the fireplace, the flames dancing and casting strange shadows across the walls and bookshelves. Gabriel's wheelchair was positioned with its back to the door, facing the fire, and she could see only the rear of the chair and his dark hair. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Scarlett realized she was alone with the crippled king in a sealed room. She stood there waiting, saying nothing, because she had learned long ago that the one who spoke first was usually the one who lost. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3, and the silence stretched until it became suffocating. Finally, Gabriel's voice broke it, still stuttering, still uneven. Yet in this darkness and stillness it carried a different weight. "Why did you agree to marry me?" Scarlett answered with the honesty she had no intention of hiding, that she had no choice, that her father sold her to pay his debts, that she was here because it was the only way to survive, not because of love or compassion or anything noble like that. Another pause followed. Then Gabriel asked again, "You don't love me?" Scarlett almost laughed at the question but held it back, instead telling him that she didn't know him well enough to love or hate him. But she wouldn't lie. She hated lies more than anything in the world. The wheelchair turned slowly, and Gabriel faced her in the firelight. His face was still pale, his eyes still seemed dull, but there was something else there, a focus she hadn't seen before. He reached into the pocket of the jacket draped over his lap and pulled out a thick envelope, then tossed it onto the floor in front of Scarlett. $100,000, Gabriel said, this time without stuttering. "Enough for you to run, to start a new life anywhere you want. Mexico, Canada, Europe. No one will look for you." Scarlett looked down at the envelope, then back at Gabriel. Her heart pounded in her chest because this was an escape, an opportunity she had never dared to dream of. Freedom. $100,000 was enough for her to disappear, enough to start over, enough to avoid marrying a man she didn't truly know. But then she thought of Ryan. If she ran, she'd never find her brother. If she ran, she'd lose every chance to gain the resources she needed for the search. And if she ran, Victor Crane would kill her father. And no matter how much she hated Robert Hayes, she didn't want to carry that blood debt for the rest of her life. She bent down, picked up the envelope, and walked toward Gabriel. She stopped right in front of the wheelchair, close enough to see the fire reflected in his gray eyes, then placed the envelope back in his lap. She told him she didn't need his money to run, that if she wanted to run, she'd have done it long ago, that she was here for her own reasons, and those reasons mattered more than freedom. Gabriel looked at her, and this time she knew she wasn't imagining it. The corner of his mouth curved into a small smile, the first smile she had seen on that face, and it wasn't the smile of an unstable man, but of someone who had just found what he was looking for. Gabriel said, his voice still soft but clearer than she had ever heard it. "You're very interesting, Scarlett Hayes. On our wedding night, you'll understand why I chose you." Then he turned his wheelchair back toward the fire. The meeting was over, and Scarlett left the study with her heart racing and a single question echoing relentlessly in her mind: who Gabriel Ashford truly was. The wedding took place 3 days later in the private chapel of the Ashford estate, a magnificent space with soaring vaulted ceilings, adorned with classical frescoes, and enormous stained glass windows that let the fading afternoon light spill down like diluted blood. Scarlett stood before the mirror in a white wedding dress she hadn't been allowed to choose, staring at the unfamiliar woman looking back at her and wondering whether this was a wedding or a funeral. There were no guests from her side, no father because Robert Hayes wasn't permitted to appear, no friends because she didn't have any, no one who belonged to her in a room filled with strangers wearing cold eyes and false smiles. The guests were all powerful figures from the New York underworld, bosses, smugglers, corrupt politicians, all gathered to witness the crippled king marry an unknown girl from Queens. They whispered behind her back, cruel words they didn't bother to hide, saying she was nothing but a cheap whore bought at a bargain price, that Gabriel Ashford must have been truly desperate to choose something like her, that this marriage was nothing more than the farce of a madman. Scarlett heard everything and said nothing. She was used to being humiliated, used to being looked down on, used to swallowing pain and continuing forward. When she walked into the chapel alone with no one to lead her, Gabriel was already there in his wheelchair at the end of the aisle, his head tilted to one side as always, with Marcus Cole standing behind him like a stone statue. Victor Crane stood beside Gabriel like a guardian rather than a best man, his cold gray eyes tracking Scarlett's every step with undisguised calculation. The ceremony was brief and cold, much like the estate itself. The priest recited the prayers in a flat tone as if reading a business contract, and perhaps that was exactly what it was. When it came time for the vows, Scarlett knelt beside the wheelchair and took Gabriel's hand. It was warmer and steadier than she expected, not trembling the way his appearance suggested, and once again she felt that strange contradiction. Gabriel stuttered through his vows in a broken voice, but when he reached the words "until death," his voice suddenly became firm and clear, and his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Then the moment passed as quickly as it came. Gabriel returned to his familiar vacant demeanor, and Scarlett wondered how much of what she had seen she had imagined. After the ceremony, While the guests sipped champagne and traded conspiracies in the shadows, Victor Crane approached Scarlet and gripped her hand hard enough to bruise. He murmured in her ear, his voice sweet as honey yet cold as ice, welcoming her to the family, saying he hoped she'd know her place, saying brides who didn't usually met very unfortunate ends. Scarlet met his gaze and replied that she'd survived hell, that he wasn't the most frightening thing she'd ever faced. Victor smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, then released her hand and walked away. Maxwell appeared immediately afterward, blocking her path with his wide grin and familiar predatory stare. He said that whenever she needed a real man, she knew where to find him, that tonight would surely be very lonely beside a cripple like Gabriel. Scarlet didn't answer. She walked past him as if he didn't exist, but inside her, the list of those who would one day have to pay had just gained 2 new names. The bridal suite was located on the highest floor of the estate, a vast room with soaring ceilings, deep red velvet curtains, and a king-size bed dressed in sheets of snow-white silk. Hundreds of candles burned throughout the room, their flames dancing and casting eerie shadows across the walls, and the scent of roses lingered in the air as if someone were trying to manufacture romance for something that was anything but romantic. Scarlet entered the room alone, the door closing behind her with a soft click, and she saw Gabriel's wheelchair positioned beside the window, turned away from her just as it had been in the study the night before. She drew a deep breath and told herself that no matter what happened tonight, she would endure it. She had survived worse than this. She would not break. She moved to the center of the room and stopped, waiting, not knowing what she was waiting for, but feeling in her bones that this night wouldn't unfold the way she had prepared herself for. Then she heard the sound, the metallic scrape of wheels against the floor, but not the sound of the chair moving, rather the sound of someone rising from it. Scarlet's heart skipped a beat. She saw Gabriel's shadow cast against the wall, and that shadow was changing, stretching upward, standing tall. No, it couldn't be, she told herself. He couldn't walk. He was paralyzed. He was the crippled king. Everyone said so. But then Gabriel Ashford turned around, and Scarlet felt as if the ground beneath her had vanished. He was standing. Gabriel Ashford was standing before her on his own legs, 1 meter, 85, tall, broad-shouldered, muscles taut beneath his white shirt, with not a single trace of the infirmity she had been shown for days. He stepped toward her, each movement steady and commanding. No stumble, no weakness, only the raw power of a predator closing in on its prey. Scarlet backed away until her spine met the wall, and she realized she was trembling, not from fear but from shock, from the complete collapse of everything she thought she knew. Gabriel stopped directly in front of her, close enough for her to feel his breath, close enough to see that his gray eyes were now sharp as blades, not a hint of emptiness left in them. When he spoke, his voice was no longer broken or stuttering, but low, clear, and filled with authority. 3 years, he said. 3 years I sat in that wheelchair so they would believe I was finished. Scarlet couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, trying to process what was happening. Gabriel continued, his voice cold as steel yet burning like fire. 3 years I watched them laugh, watched them carve up my empire, watched them pat my shoulder as if I were a pitiful child. 3 years I let them believe my mind had shattered along with my legs. He lifted his hand, touched Scarlet's chin, and raised her face so she had to look directly into his eyes. They had no idea, Gabriel whispered, that I was watching, listening, recording every name, every betrayal, every act of treachery in a black ledger that would one day come due. Scarlet found her voice at last, a single word slipping from her lips. Why? Gabriel smiled. The first true smile she had seen on that face. And it wasn't warm. It was cold and dangerous and terrifyingly beautiful. Because Victor Crane tried to kill me, Gabriel replied. The car explosion 3 years ago. He was the one behind it. He wanted my empire, my power, everything I built, and he thought he had succeeded. He tilted his head, studying Scarlet with curiosity. But I survived, Gabriel went on. And I decided that if they wanted a crippled king, I would give them a crippled king. I would let them grow comfortable, let them reveal themselves, let them make mistakes. And when the time came, I would stand up and burn everything to the ground. Scarlet understood then. She understood all of it. The wheelchair wasn't a prison, it was camouflage. The infirmity wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. Gabriel Ashford wasn't a victim. He was a predator waiting in the dark. And now he stood before her, tall and dangerous and nothing like what she had imagined. And she didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Fear or relief or something else entirely she didn't dare name. Gabriel looked at her, his gray eyes deep as a bottomless abyss, and said the words she would remember for the rest of her life. Now the game truly begins. Gabriel walked to the small table by the window, poured a glass of whiskey, and handed it to Scarlett. "You need this," he said, and she took it with hands that were still trembling from shock. He poured another glass for himself and sat down in the armchair across from her, not the wheelchair that had imprisoned him for 3 years, and began to tell the story she needed to hear. 3 years ago, Gabriel said, his voice low and even as if he were speaking about someone else's life instead of his own. "I was at the peak of my power. Ashford Empire controlled half of New York, from the ports to the casinos, from real estate to the most profitable transport routes on the East Coast. I had everything, and I believed I was untouchable." He took a sip of whiskey, the candlelight reflecting in his deep gray eyes. "But I was wrong," Gabriel continued. "I didn't see the enemy standing right beside me. Victor Crane, the man my father pulled off the streets when he was nothing but a gutter kid. The man I trusted like a brother. The man I handed half my empire to run." Scarlett listened. She took a small sip of whiskey and felt the warmth spread down her throat, steadying her enough to process what he was revealing. "That night I was on my way back from a meeting," Gabriel said. "Marcus was driving as always. When we stopped at the red light at 52nd Street and Madison Avenue, the car exploded." He paused, his eyes fixed on empty space, as if seeing it all again. "I remember the fire," Gabriel said more softly. "I remember the sound of metal tearing apart. I remember the smell of gasoline and blood. I remember the feeling that the entire world was exploding around me. Marcus dragged me from the wreckage. He was badly injured but still forced himself to get me to the hospital, and that's the only reason I'm still alive." Scarlett asked quietly how he knew Victor was behind it. Gabriel smiled without warmth. "Because in the hospital, while I was still in a coma, Marcus overheard Victor talking on the phone to someone. He said the job was done. He said Gabriel Ashford would never wake up. He said the empire was his now." Gabriel set his glass down and looked straight into Scarlett's eyes. "When I woke up," he said, "the doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. They said I might never walk again. They said my brain could be damaged. And that's when I realized this was an opportunity. The only opportunity to uncover everyone who had betrayed me." Scarlett understood then. She whispered, "You pretended to be crippled so they'd lower their guard." Gabriel nodded. "I let them believe Gabriel Ashford was dead, not in body but in spirit. I sat in that wheelchair and played the role of a cripple, a man who couldn't control his body or his mind. I let them pat my shoulder and speak to me like I was a child. I swallowed that humiliation every day because I knew that one day they'd pay for it 1,000 times over." He stood, walked to the oak cabinet in the corner, opened a hidden drawer, and took out a black leather-bound notebook. "This is the Black Ledger," Gabriel said, as he handed it to Scarlett. "For 3 years, in the dead of night, while the household slept, and with Marcus guarding my door, I've written everything down. Every name, every transaction, every secret meeting, every moment of betrayal they thought I didn't see." Scarlett opened the notebook and saw pages filled with neat handwritten lines, names, numbers written out in words, dates, locations, all arranged with the precision of an indictment waiting to be read aloud. Victor Crane, James Sterling, Senator Thomas Harrington. Gabriel spoke each name, and dozens of others. Every one of them had a hand in trying to overthrow me. Every one of them is dividing up what they think I can no longer protect. He took the notebook back and snapped it shut with a solid final sound, like a coffin lid closing. 3 years I waited, Gabriel said. 3 years I gathered proof. 3 years I planned for this moment, and now I have everything I need. Everything except one thing. One person they'll never suspect. Someone who can move freely in a world I was barred from. Someone who can be my eyes and ears where a wheelchair couldn't go. Scarlett understood. She set her whiskey down and stood to face him. "That's why you need me," she said. Not a question, but a statement. "You need a wife no one takes seriously. An unknown girl from Queens they'll ignore. A pawn on the board no one believes could threaten them." Gabriel looked at her, and for the first time that night, his eyes held something that resembled respect. "You understand quickly," he said. "That's one of the reasons I chose you. But it's not the only reason." Scarlett looked at Gabriel with narrowed eyes and asked what the other reason was. Gabriel set the black ledger on the table and walked to the window, gazing out at the Manhattan night sky where lights shimmered like millions of artificial stars. "I've been watching you for 2 years, he said without turning around. "Ever since you first appeared on the list of people your father owed money to. I know about the 3 jobs you work every day. I know about the beatings you've taken from creditors. I know about the scar on your back from when some piece of trash threatened you with a knife because you didn't have money to pay." A chill ran down Scarlett's spine. Not from fear, but from the realization that she'd been observed for so long without ever knowing. Gabriel turned to face her, and his gray eyes held something close to admiration. "But the reason I chose you isn't because you endure pain well," he said. "It's because you never submit. I saw you stand in front of a creditor twice your size, watched him slap you, spit on you, and you didn't bow your head. You looked at him like he was a worm, and I knew then that you were the woman I needed." Scarlett didn't know how to react to that confession. She stood there, feeling something strange rise in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The feeling of being seen, of being acknowledged, of being valued for what she truly was. Then Gabriel continued, and what he said next stopped every thought in her mind. "And I know about Ryan," Gabriel said, his voice softer now, as if he understood the weight of that name. Scarlett felt as though someone had punched her in the chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at him with wide eyes and trembling lips. "Ryan," she whispered, the name leaving her mouth like a prayer. "My brother. What do you know about my brother?" Gabriel stepped closer, close enough for her to see every line of his face in the candlelight. "I know your father sold him to traffickers 9 years ago," Gabriel said. "I know you've searched for him for 9 years without results. I know you spent every dollar you saved hiring investigators, that you went into the most dangerous places in New York looking for clues, that you did everything a girl without power and without money could possibly do." Tears welled in Scarlett's eyes, the first tears in 9 years, but she angrily brushed them away because she'd sworn never to cry in front of anyone. "You know where he is?" she asked, her voice shaking but her eyes burning. "You know where my brother is, don't you?" Gabriel nodded slowly. "I do, and if you prove you're worthy, I'll give you everything. Not just information, but Ryan himself, alive and safe." Scarlett felt her knees threaten to give way, but she forced herself to stand straight. She looked at Gabriel and understood that this was the real bargain. Not a marriage for money or status, but an alliance built on mutual necessity. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady again. "What do you want me to do in exchange for Ryan?" Gabriel said he needed an ally, a partner, someone who would stand with him when he burned every traitor to the ground. He needed her eyes and ears in rooms he couldn't enter. He needed her absolute loyalty until this war was over. Scarlett was silent for a long time. She thought of Ryan, of 9 years of suffering, of everything she'd lost, and everything she could still reclaim. Then she looked straight into Gabriel's eyes and said she agreed, but she had one condition. Gabriel raised an eyebrow and asked what it was. "Victor Crane," Scarlett said, her voice cold as ice. "When you take him down, I want to see it. I want to be there when he realizes everything he built is collapsing. I want him to know that the girl he treated like garbage played a part in his destruction." Gabriel looked at her, and this time the smile that spread across his face wasn't cold. It held something almost warm, almost pleased, almost proud. "You truly are the perfect wife for me," Gabriel said. Then he took her hand, lifted it to his lips, and pressed a gentle kiss to the back of it like a vow. The agreement was sealed. From now on, we're allies, partners, husband and wife, in the only way that matters, the way only we understand. The weeks that followed passed like a strange dream Scarlett wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. By day, she continued to play the role of the devoted wife of the crippled king, pushing Gabriel's wheelchair through the mansion's corridors, tending to him under the watchful eyes of Victor Crane and his men, lowering her head and keeping silent like a bride who knew her place. But at night, when the bedroom door closed and darkness wrapped itself around the Ashford estate, a completely different Scarlett emerged. Gabriel taught her everything. He taught her how to observe, not just to look, but to truly see, how to recognize lies through the smallest movements of facial muscles, how to read body language to know who was a threat and who might become an ally. "You were born for this," Gabriel said one night when Scarlett correctly read the emotional states of 3 servants, simply from the way they walked in surveillance footage. "You have a predator's eyes without even knowing it." Scarlett didn't know whether it was a compliment or a warning, but she felt something warm spread through her chest when he said it. The long nights together gradually became something she looked forward to. They sat in the study with glasses of whiskey, while Gabriel told her about his empire, about the years spent building it from the ashes his father had left behind, about the ruthless decisions he had been forced to make to survive in the underworld. He didn't paint himself as a hero, didn't pretend his hands were clean. He told her the raw truth and let her judge for herself. And Scarlett, who had seen humanity's darkest side since she was very young, didn't judge. She listened and understood that in this world, sometimes monsters were the only ones who could protect you from other monsters. Then it was her turn. She told him about her mother, about the cancer that took the only woman who had ever loved her unconditionally. She told him about her father, about how he turned from a weak man into a gambling demon after her mother died. She told him about Ryan, about the brother she couldn't protect, about 9 years spent living with guilt and pain for watching him be taken right in front of her. She told him everything without crying, because her tears had long since run dry, but her voice trembled and her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Gabriel didn't speak while she talked. He simply listened, his gray eyes never leaving her face. And when she finished, he did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and took her hand, saying nothing, just holding it firmly in his warm grasp like a promise that didn't need words. That was the moment Scarlett realized something was changing between them. Something beyond the agreement and the alliance. Something dangerous and beautiful she didn't dare name. She began to notice small things about Gabriel she hadn't seen before. The way he always made sure she ate properly because he knew she once skipped meals to save money. The way he arranged the books she liked on the shelf in her bedroom. The way his gray eyes softened whenever he looked at her, even though his face remained icy in front of others. And Gabriel was changing too. Scarlett could feel it. He began asking for her opinion on important decisions, began sharing worries he told no one else, began looking at her not just as an ally but as an equal. One night, while they were reviewing surveillance footage for evidence of Victor's conspiracy, Scarlett accidentally fell asleep against Gabriel's shoulder from exhaustion. When she woke several hours later, she realized she was lying in bed with a blanket carefully pulled over her, and Gabriel was sitting in the armchair beside the bed, watching her with an expression she couldn't explain. He didn't say anything. He simply stood and left the room. But Scarlett had seen it. She had seen what Gabriel tried to hide behind his wall of ice, and it made her heart race in a way she wasn't used to. She told herself this was just a deal, that she was here for Ryan, that she couldn't allow emotions to cloud her judgment. But with each passing night, that reassurance grew harder to believe, and Scarlett realized she was stepping into territory more dangerous than any war with Victor Crane, the territory of the heart. The party was held at the Ashford estate on a Saturday night, an event Victor Crane had arranged to strengthen his ties with underworld partners, and of course to continue asserting his authority, while Gabriel still sat in his wheelchair. Scarlett stood beside her husband in a black evening gown Gabriel had chosen for her, the neckline cut low enough to be elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair swept up to reveal her pale neck, and the diamond earrings she knew were worth more than everything she had earned in 9 years of relentless work. She played her role perfectly, standing quietly behind Gabriel's wheelchair, lowering her head modestly whenever someone approached to greet them, pretending to be nothing more than a harmless ornament beside the crippled king. But her eyes never stopped observing, memorizing every face, every conversation, every meaningful handshake, applying everything Gabriel had taught her over the past weeks. Then Maxwell Crane appeared. He walked up with a glass of champagne in hand, and his familiar smug smile, blonde hair slicked neatly back, and an expensive gray suit hugging a body carefully sculpted by training. He didn't even glance at Gabriel, as if Gabriel didn't exist, but stopped directly in front of Scarlett and told her she looked stunning tonight, that it was a waste for a flower like her to wither beside a rotten stump. Scarlett didn't answer. She simply looked at him with the cold gaze she had cultivated over 9 years. But Maxwell wasn't the type to be discouraged. He stepped closer, brazenly invading her personal space, and murmured that he knew she was lonely, that Gabriel couldn't satisfy the needs of a young woman like her, that he could give her what he was sure Gabriel couldn't. Nausea rose in Scarlett's throat, but before she could step back, Maxwell reached out and grabbed her waist, pulling her closer with a possessive motion, as if she were an object he had the right to touch. Her body went rigid, survival instincts honed by years of abuse freezing her in place for a split second. And in that moment, she heard a faint sound behind her, the metallic scrape of wheelchair wheels against marble, and she knew Gabriel had seen everything. Scarlett turned and saw her husband still seated in his wheelchair with his familiar vacant expression, but his hands were gripping the armrests so hard his knuckles had turned white, and even though his face showed nothing, Scarlett could feel the fury burning beneath that icy surface. She knew Gabriel wanted to stand, wanted to stride forward, and tear Maxwell apart right there in front of everyone. But he couldn't. Not yet. Because the plan wasn't complete, and his cover mattered more than momentary rage. Maxwell sneered. He had noticed Gabriel's restrained reaction, and it only fueled his arrogance. He tightened his grip on Scarlett's waist, and said loudly enough for those nearby to hear that she should consider his offer, that a woman like her deserved a real man, not a cripple who could only sit still and drool. Scarlett wrenched herself free and replied in a voice loud enough to silence the entire room that she appreciated his concern, but she'd rather stand beside a man with dignity in a wheelchair than a stray dog that did nothing but bark and sniff at women's skirts. The room held its breath, A few people stifled laughter, and Maxwell's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. He shot Scarlett a look that promised revenge, then turned and stormed away. That night, when they returned to their private quarters and the door closed behind them, Gabriel said nothing at first. He stood with his back to Scarlett, and she saw his hands clenched so tightly that blood seeped from the crescent marks left by his nails. "He'll pay," Gabriel finally said, his voice low and dangerous, like distant thunder warning of an approaching storm. "I swear to you he'll pay for daring to touch you." And Scarlett, for the first time in her life, saw the fierce possessiveness in a man's eyes directed at her, and she didn't know whether she should be afraid or feel safe. 2 weeks after that party, Gabriel woke Scarlett at 3 a.m. and told her she needed to go with him right now. She didn't ask why. She had learned that when Gabriel spoke in that voice, with that look in his eyes, it meant it mattered. They left the estate through the back entrance, where Marcus was already waiting with a black SUV, and drove through the empty streets of New York at dawn. Scarlett didn't know where they were going. Gabriel didn't say, and she didn't ask. She sat in silence, watching the streetlights slide past the windows like blurred streaks of light. After nearly an hour, the car stopped in front of a small house in the suburbs, a house so ordinary it vanished among dozens of identical ones on the quiet street. Gabriel turned to Scarlett and said that inside was something that belonged to her, something he had kept safe for a year, and now it was time for her to have it back. Scarlett felt her heart begin to race, a strange intuition rising in her chest, but she didn't dare believe, didn't dare hope, because she had hoped too many times and been disappointed too many times over the past 9 years. She stepped out of the car and followed Gabriel to the front door. Marcus opened it and stepped aside, and Scarlett walked into the house with her heart pounding wildly and her legs trembling. The small living room was lit by warm yellow light. There was an old sofa, a television, a small bookshelf, everything painfully ordinary. Then she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, a thin young man with curly brown hair and brown eyes she would recognize even if 1,000,000 years passed. Eyes just like their mother's, the eyes of the brother she had lost 9 years ago, Ryan. The name slipped from Scarlett's lips like a broken whisper, like a prayer she had repeated through thousands of nights over 9 long years. The young man turned around, and when he saw Scarlett, his eyes widened, his lips trembled, and he cried out a name she thought she'd never hear again, Scarlett. She didn't know how she moved. She only knew that in the next moment she was in front of Ryan, her hands cradling his thin face, and she was crying, the first tears in 9 years pouring out as if a dam had finally burst. She cried and called her brother's name, holding him as if afraid that if she let go he would disappear again. Ryan cried too. He clung to his sister and said he was sorry, that he had tried to find her but couldn't, that he thought he'd never see her again. They stood there wrapped in each other's arms, 2 shattered pieces of a broken family finally fitting back together, and Scarlett cried for 9 years of suffering, cried for the nights she lay awake, wondering if her brother was still alive, cried for all the hope she had buried because she was too afraid to believe. She didn't know how much time passed before she finally pulled back and looked at Ryan properly. He was 23 now, taller than she remembered, thinner than she wished, with scars on his wrists she didn't dare ask about. But he was alive. He was standing there in front of her, and that was all that mattered. Gabriel stood in the doorway, silently watching the reunion with eyes Scarlett couldn't read. She turned to look at him, the man who had given her the gift she never dared dream of, the man who had found her brother in a brothel in Mexico and brought him back, treated him, protected him for a year without saying a word. She stepped toward Gabriel, tears still filling her eyes, and she didn't know what to say. There were no words that could hold what she was feeling, so she didn't speak. Instead, she lifted her hand, touched Gabriel's face, and kissed him. Their first kiss wasn't the kiss of a bargain or an alliance. It was a kiss of the deepest gratitude, of feelings she could no longer deny, of a heart frozen for 9 years finally beginning to thaw. Gabriel stood still for the first moment, as if he hadn't expected it. Then his arms went around her waist and pulled her closer, and he kissed her back with a tenderness she never imagined a man like him could possess. When they parted, Gabriel looked into her eyes and said in a low, steady voice that he'd burn the entire world for her. And Scarlett, tears still on her cheeks and her brother standing safe behind her, replied that then they'd burn it together. Scarlett didn't know that Victor Crane had begun to suspect her after that night's party. Didn't know that the way her eyes lingered on Gabriel had changed in a way a predator like Victor could recognize. Didn't know that he had sent people to watch her for weeks and had recorded every late-night private meeting between her and her husband. What she did know was that 3 days after seeing Ryan again, while she was on her way back from the hair salon to the Ashford estate as part of the cover Gabriel had arranged for her. A black van cut her off in a deserted alley. She didn't have time to react or scream. Two large men grabbed her and pressed a cloth soaked in chloroform over her face, and the world went dark. When Scarlett woke up, she found herself tied to a metal chair in an abandoned warehouse. The stench of damp and engine oil burning her nose, weak light from a few flickering overhead bulbs spilling down to form broken patches of light and shadow across the cracked concrete floor. Her head throbbed like it was being split open, and her wrists burned from the rough rope. But she forced herself to stay alert, forced herself to observe as Gabriel had taught her, searching for anything that might help her escape. Then she heard footsteps echoing across the concrete, and Maxwell Crane stepped out of the darkness wearing the smile she had learned to hate. He looked different from before. The fake charm was gone, exposing his true nature, a predator with hungry, merciless eyes. Maxwell said his father wanted to know what she was hiding, that she had changed too much since coming to the Ashford estate, that no girl from Queens carried herself the way she did unless she was playing some kind of game. Scarlett didn't answer. She stared at him with the icy gaze she had perfected over years, but inside her heart was pounding with fear. Maxwell crouched to her eye level and said he had ways of making women talk, that he'd done it many times and always succeeded, that she wouldn't be any different. Then he reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers sliding down her neck to her collarbone, and nausea rose in Scarlett's throat. She spat in his face. Maxwell stepped back, wiped his face with his sleeve, and his smile vanished, replaced by cold fury. He slapped her so hard her head snapped to the side and her ears rang. But Scarlett didn't cry or beg. She turned back to him and smiled through bloodied lips, because she had endured worse than this, had been beaten by men stronger than him, and she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Maxwell lost control. He grabbed her collar and tore it open, buttons flying across the floor. And Scarlett knew he wouldn't stop, knew he'd do terrible things to her before killing her or handing her over to his father. She struggled, kicked at him with her free legs, but Maxwell grabbed her hair and yanked her head back, with such force her neck felt like it might snap. He whispered in her ear that she had humiliated him in front of everyone at the party, that she'd pay for it, that when he was done with her, even Gabriel wouldn't want to look at her anymore. Tears welled in Scarlett's eyes, not from pain or fear, but from rage, from helplessness, from the knowledge that she was alone here and no one knew where she was. She thought of Gabriel, of Ryan, of everything she had just regained and might lose, and wondered if this was how her story ended. Then, just as Maxwell started to hike her dress up, a blast rang out. Not gunfire, but the sound of the warehouse door being kicked off its hinges. And there in the doorway, standing tall with a gun in his hand, and gray eyes blazing with a fury she had never seen, was Gabriel Ashford, not the crippled king bound to a wheelchair, but a king reclaiming his throne with blood and fire. Maxwell froze in place, his hand still gripping Scarlett's dress, and his face shifted from savage rage to sheer terror in a single instant when he saw Gabriel standing upright in the doorway. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You can't walk. You're crippled. You're nothing." Gabriel didn't answer. He simply walked into the warehouse with steady, commanding steps, the gun in his hand aimed straight at Maxwell, and behind him were Marcus Cole and 6 men dressed in black with their weapons ready. "Take your hands off my wife," Gabriel said, his voice cold as ice yet burning like molten lava, every word delivered with the perfect control of a man who had waited 3 years for this moment. Maxwell released Scarlett and staggered backward, his eyes darting around the warehouse searching for an escape. But Gabriel's men had sealed every exit. He stammered that this was a misunderstanding, that he didn't know, that his father had ordered it, that he was only following instructions. Gabriel stepped closer until he was less than a meter away, and looked at Maxwell with an expression Scarlett had never seen before, the gaze of a king passing judgment on a traitor. "You're blaming your father," Gabriel said. "But did your father order you to touch my wife, to tear her clothes, to look at her like a starving animal?" Maxwell began to shake. He dropped to his knees and begged, saying he'd do anything, that he'd confess everything about his father's schemes, that he could still be useful. Gabriel looked down at the man kneeling at his feet and asked which hand he had planned to use to touch my wife. Maxwell stared at his own hands in horror, and before he could answer, Gabriel fired a single shot into Maxwell's right hand. Maxwell's scream echoed through the warehouse as blood sprayed and he collapsed onto the floor clutching the shattered hand, howling like a wounded beast. Gabriel stepped over him as if he were nothing more than debris, moved to Scarlett, and knelt to untie her. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he loosened the ropes that had bitten into her wrists, and once she was free, he removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders to cover the torn dress. "Are you hurt?" Gabriel asked, his voice calm but his gray eyes sweeping over her body for injuries, and Scarlet could see the fury still burning beneath that calm surface, ready to erupt and destroy anyone who had dared harm her. Scarlet nodded. She didn't trust her voice in that moment. She only knew she was safe, that Gabriel had come, that she wasn't alone anymore. Gabriel stood and turned back to Maxwell, who was still screaming on the floor, then ordered 2 of his men to take him away, saying he wasn't allowed to die yet, that he still needed him to send a message to Victor Crane. As Maxwell was dragged away, Gabriel returned to Scarlet and helped her to her feet, one arm wrapping around her waist to steady her as her legs still trembled from everything she had endured. "How did you find me?" Scarlet asked as they stepped out of the warehouse into the cool air of the late night. Gabriel said he had placed a tracking device inside her wedding ring from the very first day, that he never let her go anywhere without knowing where she was, that he had sworn to protect her and he always kept his promises. Scarlet looked down at the diamond ring on her finger. The ring she had once believed was nothing more than decoration for a sham marriage, and she realized Gabriel had been guarding her safety long before she knew who he truly was. They climbed into the waiting SUV. Marcus took the driver's seat and pulled away immediately. As the vehicle left the abandoned industrial zone behind, Scarlet rested her head on Gabriel's shoulder and felt his arms tighten around her as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. "Victor will know," she said softly. "He'll know you can walk, that everything was an act." Gabriel nodded and said yes, the act ended tonight, that he had all the evidence he needed, that it was time for Victor Crane and every traitor to pay. He looked into Scarlet's eyes with burning resolve and said that in 3 days there would be a grand party at the Ashford estate, that all his enemies would be there, that it would be the night the crippled king stood up and reclaimed everything. "And I'll be beside you," Scarlet said, not as a question but as a certainty. Gabriel smiled, his first smile since entering the warehouse, and replied that he couldn't do this without her, that she was his queen, and a king was never complete without his queen at his side when he reclaimed his throne. 3 days later, the Ashford estate was illuminated like a palace in the night, thousands of crystal lights pouring rich golden brilliance through towering windows, while luxury cars streamed along the stone-paved drive toward the main gate. This was the grandest celebration the Ashford family had hosted since Gabriel's injury 3 years earlier, and invitations had been sent to every powerful figure in New York's underworld, along with politicians and businessmen tied to the Ashford empire. Victor Crane was the one who had arranged the event, officially to formally introduce the new Mrs. Ashford to their elite circle and celebrate Gabriel's stable condition, though everyone knew the true purpose was for Victor to assert his authority as the real power behind the Ashford empire, while Gabriel still sat in a wheelchair. Scarlet stood before the mirror in the dressing room, studying the unfamiliar woman staring back at her in a deep crimson evening gown, the color of dried blood, its high, elegant neckline concealing the bruises on her throat that had not fully healed, long gloves hiding the abrasions on her wrists left by rope. She was ready for this night, ready to stand beside Gabriel as he reclaimed everything that was his, ready to watch Victor Crane fall. Gabriel entered the room, and for the final time in his life he lowered himself into the wheelchair that had been his voluntary prison for 3 long years. He looked at Scarlet with deep gray eyes and told her she was breathtaking, that Victor would not realize what was coming until it was far too late, that tonight everything would end. Scarlet leaned down and brushed a gentle kiss against his lips, then told him she would be right beside him, that they would burn it all together. Marcus Cole pushed Gabriel's wheelchair into the grand hall, where hundreds of guests sipped champagne and traded conversations thick with conspiracy. Scarlet walked at her husband's side, her head held high and her expression serene, as if she did not know that within hours this room would become a living hell for those who had betrayed him. Victor Crane stood at the center of the hall like its true master, immaculate in a black suit with a smug smile on his lips, and when he saw Gabriel wheeled inside, he approached with the false concern Scarlet had learned to despise. "Gabriel looks stronger tonight," Victor said, his voice sweet as poisoned honey. "I hope the party won't be too exhausting for you." Gabriel replied in his familiar halting tone that he was fine, that Victor had done an excellent job organizing the evening, that he was grateful for everything Victor had taken care of. Victor smiled in triumph and moved on to continue playing host, and Scarlet caught the flash of contempt he cast toward Gabriel when he thought no one was watching. James Sterling approached next, the underground financial kingpin with carefully trimmed salt and pepper beard and fox-like eyes that never stopped calculating. He offered empty pleasantries about Gabriel's health and Scarlet's beauty, while glancing toward Victor as if confirming that everything remained under control. Senator Thomas Harrington arrived with his wife, and his polished political smile, clasped Victor's hand warmly, and offered Gabriel nothing more than a cold nod, as though he were merely a pitiful ornament at his own celebration. Scarlett watched it all and memorized every face, every disdainful look, every false smile they directed at her husband. They had no idea that this would be the last night of their freedom. No idea that the man they dismissed was sitting there counting the seconds to judgment. The orchestra began a soft waltz. Couples drifted onto the dance floor, and the party unfolded like any other elite gathering, champagne flowing freely and laughter echoing through the hall. But Scarlett knew that beneath the glittering surface, Gabriel's loyal men were stationed at every exit, that the black ledger containing every piece of evidence rested in Marcus's jacket, that everything was in place for the moment Gabriel would stand and shatter the world of those who had betrayed him. She looked down at Gabriel, and he looked up at her, his gray eyes gleaming beneath the crystal lights, and he gave the slightest nod. It was time. Scarlett drew a deep breath, smoothed the crimson fabric of her gown, and stepped toward the orchestra. The night of judgment began. Scarlett stopped in the middle of the grand hall, right before the dance floor where couples were gliding through the waltz, and she raised her voice just loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite my husband to dance." The hall fell silent. The orchestra cut off mid-note. Couples froze on the floor, and hundreds of eyes turned toward Scarlett in shock and irritation. Victor Crane let out a sharp laugh from across the room and said loudly that Mrs. Ashford must have had too much champagne, that her husband couldn't dance, that someone should escort her away to rest. Scarlett didn't look at Victor. She looked straight into Gabriel's eyes and smiled, a smile only the two of them understood. Gabriel answered with a faint smile of his own, then placed both hands on the arms of his wheelchair, and, in the deadly silence of the hall, pushed himself up and stood. A scream burst from somewhere in the crowd. Someone dropped a champagne glass, and the sound of shattering crystal cracked across the marble floor like a gunshot. Victor Crane froze, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to pure horror in a heartbeat, gray eyes wide as he stared at what he was seeing. Gabriel Ashford stood tall in the center of the hall, 6'1", broad-shouldered, muscles defined beneath his flawless black suit, with not a single trace of the disability they had believed in for 3 years. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate calm, smoothed his lapel as if he had all the time in the world, then walked toward Scarlett with steady, authoritative steps. "I believe they're playing a waltz," Gabriel said, his voice deep and clear, without the slightest stutter, and he extended his hand to her. "Dance with me, my wife." Scarlett placed her hand in his, and they stepped onto the floor. The orchestra, snapping out of its shock, began playing again with a trembling tempo, and Gabriel guided Scarlett across the dance floor with the flawless grace of a man trained from childhood. They turned beneath the stunned stares of hundreds of guests, and Scarlett felt as though they were the center of the universe, two souls dancing atop the ashes of those who had tried to destroy them. When the music ended, Gabriel stopped at the center of the floor and turned to face the crowd. "Marcus, lock every door." His voice rang out like the command of a king reclaiming his throne. Doors slammed shut throughout the estate, and Gabriel's loyal men appeared at every exit with weapons drawn. Panic rippled through the hall, but Gabriel raised one hand and silence fell again, as though he commanded space and time themselves. 3 years, Gabriel began, his voice echoing through the room. 3 years I sat in that wheelchair and watched you tear my empire apart like vultures feeding on a corpse. 3 years I let you pat my shoulder and speak to me like I was a helpless child. 3 years I recorded every betrayal, every deal, every scheme in this black ledger. Marcus stepped forward and handed Gabriel the black leather-bound book, and Gabriel raised it for all to see. "Victor Crane," Gabriel called first. "The man who planted the bomb in my car 3 years ago. The man who colluded with the Bratva to overthrow me. The man who thought he could kill me and take everything I built." Victor tried to run for the rear exit, but 2 of Gabriel's men seized him and forced him to his knees in the center of the dance floor. "James Sterling," Gabriel continued. "The man who laundered money for the coup, who financed those who tried to kill me. Senator Thomas Harrington, the man who ordered the FBI to look the other way after the car explosion, who accepted bribes to shield the traitors." One by one they were dragged out and thrown to the floor beside Victor, faces drained white with terror. Gabriel stepped in front of Victor Crane and looked down at the man who had once been his right hand, the man who betrayed him, tried to murder him, and ordered the kidnapping and humiliation of his wife. "You wonder why I didn't kill you the moment I knew," Gabriel said. "Death is too quick, Victor. I wanted you to lose everything first. Your money, your power, your name, then your life." Gabriel turned to Scarlett and asked if she wanted to watch. Scarlett stepped to her husband's side, met Victor Crane's eyes with a gaze colder than ice, and said, "This is for everyone you destroyed, for the car explosion, for the 3 years my husband lived in a wheelchair, and for what your son tried to do to me in that warehouse." The lights in the hall snapped off. Darkness swallowed the room, and gunshots rang out in the blackness. 1, 2, 3. Each shot a sentence carried out. When the lights came back on, Victor Crane, James Sterling, and Senator Thomas Harrington lay motionless on the marble floor, their blood spreading like deep red flowers against white stone. Gabriel stood at the center of the hall, his hand gripping Scarlett's, and he looked at the remaining guests with the eyes of a king who had reclaimed his throne. "The crippled king is dead," Gabriel declared, his voice booming like thunder. "Gabriel Ashford has returned, and anyone who still thinks of betraying me, look at the floor and remember the fate of those who came before you." No one dared breathe, no one dared move, and in that deathly silence, Gabriel pulled Scarlett into his arms and kissed her in the blood-soaked hall. A kiss of victory, of love, of rising from the ashes. After that night of judgment, the New York underworld was never the same again. News of Gabriel Ashford's return spread like wildfire, and those who once mocked the crippled king now trembled at the sound of his name. The Ashford Empire was stronger than it had ever been. No informants, no traitors, only absolute loyalty to a king who had proven that not even death itself could stop him. Maxwell Crane survived the wound to his hand, but was expelled from New York with a warning that if he ever returned, death would be the gentlest fate he could expect. The remaining accomplices of Victor were given a choice: swear loyalty to Gabriel or disappear forever, and no one dared choose the second option after witnessing the fate of those who came before them. 1 week after the party, Robert Hayes asked to see his daughter. Scarlett stood in the living room of the Ashford estate and watched the man who had brought her into this world walk in with the same familiar cowardice, head bowed and shoulders trembling, just as they had the day he sold her to Gabriel. Robert begged for forgiveness, saying he had no choice, that he had done everything for his family, that he loved her in his own way. Scarlett listened in silence, then told him that he was no longer her father, that her father had died the night he sold Ryan to traffickers, that she would not kill him, but she would never forgive him. Gabriel offered to handle Robert the way the underworld did, but Scarlett shook her head and said she wanted him to live in poverty and loneliness, to live with the memory of what he had done to his children, because that punishment was more painful than death. Robert Hayes was banished from New York with a small sum just enough to survive, and Scarlett never saw him again. 3 years later, on a spring morning filled with golden sunlight, Scarlett stood in the garden of the Ashford estate, watching her 3-year-old daughter run across the lush green lawn. Isabella Grace Ashford had her father's gray eyes and her mother's black hair, a smile that could melt the coldest heart, and laughter that rang through the garden like the sweetest music Scarlett had ever known. Gabriel stepped up behind his wife and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched their daughter together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Scarlett smiled and said she was thinking about the long road she had walked, from a decaying apartment in Queens to this place, from a girl sold like property to the queen of the Ashford Empire, from a woman without hope to a mother, a wife, and a sister who had found her brother again. Ryan was now 26, finishing his final year of medical school on a full scholarship Gabriel had quietly funded, and he would become a doctor just as he had dreamed when he was a 14-year-old boy sitting by the window reading about the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Scarlett asked. "Everything we did." Gabriel was silent for a moment before saying that he regretted only one thing: not finding her sooner. Scarlett turned to look at her husband, the man who had given her everything she never dared to dream of: justice, family, love, and a future she once believed would never belong to her. "I would burn the whole world again for you, Gabriel Ashford," she said. "And I would do the same for you, my queen," Gabriel replied. Then he kissed her beneath the spring sun while Isabella's laughter echoed through the garden. This is a story about a king who sat in darkness for 3 years waiting for the moment to rise, about a queen who walked through hell to find heaven, about love born from the ashes of betrayal and blooming in the light of revenge. If you are listening to this story during a difficult moment in your life, if you feel overlooked, underestimated, or abandoned, remember that your story isn't over, that those who look down on you have no right to write your ending, that only you can decide who you become. Stand when they expect you to fall, shine when they want you to fade, love when they think you are only capable of hatred, and when the time comes, look those who underestimated you straight in the eyes and show them just how wrong they were. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with those you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more moving stories every day. We would love to know how this story made you feel, whether it reminded you of something in your own life, whether you have ever been underestimated and proved them wrong. Share your story in the comments below. We read every word straight from your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.